Dark Souls 3 is part of the Dark Souls series, which has become so popular it spawned the entire Souls-like genre. However, I believe that many games outside of FromSoftware's surpasses the original series, such as these three Souls-likes: Nine Souls, Lies of P, and Kazan. Comparatively, Dark Souls 3 does not hold up for me today. There are 5 main things I want to talk about with the game, which I'll delve into today. I've beaten the game 9 times, completed the 100% on Steam, and hitlist most major bosses. Despite all that time invested, I want to tell new players why I didn't click with the game, but if you're able to overlook these flaws, you'll find that the game is solid otherwise. Before we get into the negatives, I want to quickly mention a lot of the features I liked about the full game. If I had one thing to complain about for games like Nine Souls and Sekiro, it would be the lack of weapon and build variety, for which Dark Souls 3 has a lot of. I also think the atmosphere and lore of Dark Souls 3 is amazing, especially as the inspiration comes from one of my all-time favorite manga, Berserk. But now, let's get into it. First, let's talk about this game's bosses. In the base game of Dark Souls 3, there are a handful of bosses I enjoy. Let's start with the bosses I personally love. Extremely underrated boss in my opinion is Vordt of the Boreal Valley. He has well telegraphed attacks that feel like they have weight behind them. I see him as a mini Guardian 8 from Sekiro, however, his runback is not great. I also think that Soul of Cinder is a 10 out of 10 boss. This boss is a great melee fight with great soundtrack, visuals, and well telegraphed attacks. It feels like this boss was a fixed version of Abyss Watchers, which I will get to later. I also think that Ludex Gundyr and his counterpart Champion Gundyr are great bosses. Ludex is a good introductory boss, while Champion is solidly fun with long combos, though he's not very unique, and that's fine. Personally, I like spending my time fighting bosses, learning their combos, and beating a difficult challenge. This is one area which I find lacking in Dark Souls 3, especially the base game. I think the DLC vastly improves many of my problems, especially with the bosses. Bosses such as Pontiff, Old Demon King, and Dragonslayer Armor are decent, but they weren't particularly interesting to me, even with their gimmicks. Pontiff's clone can be killed before they get their first attack off because of how little their health is. I think this boss would have done much better if their clone could not be killed. I also think that the projectiles added in Phase 2 of Dragonslayer Armor do not add much to the fight. These bosses weren't very visually interesting, but again, were decent bosses, as I don't have large complaints for them. They're about a 7 or 8 out of 10. I also want to get the gimmick bosses out of the way. Curse-Rotted Greatwood, Deacons of the Deep, High Lord Wolnir, Yorm the Giant, and Ancient Wyvern are not fun bosses. In my opinion, a good gimmick boss is not easily defeated once you know the gimmick, and instead the battle is helped by your knowledge of the gimmick. Look at Aratra from Kazan. You don't need to break their limbs to do damage, but the battle is much easier when you learn that you are able to. And while the DLC has some of my favorite bosses, it also has my 2 least favorite, such as Champion Gravetender and Half-Light of the Church. Mage bosses such as Crystal Sage and Aldrich are also not particularly fun for me. Their attacks often feel either too hard or too easy to dodge. For example, Aldrich's arrow attack is nearly undodgeable, which doesn't make for a fun experience as it's out of your control. I would also like to talk about Nameless King. While the boss isn't terrible, I think the camera hinders Phase 1, which is annoying as I think the boss could have been very good otherwise. I still think that the boss is good, but not as good as people make him out to be. But now I want to talk about bosses I don't like. I'm not a big fan of Lothric and Lorien. I love the first phase of the Twin Princes. Lorien is fun to fight with his heavy, telegraphed attacks and teleporting moveset. However, I don't like the projectiles with the addition of Lothric in the second phase. He doesn't feel like he adds to the fight and disturbs the rhythm rather than adding to it. Compare this fight to Fushi and Nuwa from Nine Souls. I feel that the addition of Nuwa, a projectile user, adds more rhythm to the fight and makes for some more interesting boss combos. She extends already existing combos to improve the boss. It feels more like Lothric disturbs the rhythm by attacking with his projectiles, making the fight feel somewhat unpolished. His gimmick of reviving his brother is cool, but because of how little health he has, attacking Lorien's back pretty much negates this gimmick. Next, I want to talk about Abyss Watchers. This is a boss I have a lot of mixed feelings on. I think that their Phase 2 is one of the best, but heavily weighted down by their Phase 1. I think the Phase 1 gimmick is cool in theory, but I think it gets very annoying to deal with very quickly. You can often get hit from off the screen, sometimes get attacked by all 3 Abyss Watchers, and a lot of chaos can happen in the arena. Again, I think it's cool from a design and lore perspective that the Watchers fight each other as they're taken over by the Abyss, but from a gameplay perspective, I'm not a big fan. Related to bosses, let's talk about my least favorite thing, runbacks. The prime example is Osiris. The boss itself is not bad. He's unique and memorable as one of the few bosses who speaks in this game, though his second phase has some awkward punish windows. However, he has the worst runback in the game, and while some may say this is nothing compared to Dark Souls 2, it's still a problem. Even unlocking the elevator barely helps as there are several small monsters who attack fast on the runback. Not to mention the 2 knights with greatswords near the end who can sometimes hit you through the fog gate. According to a user on Reddit, measuring the runback times, Osiris takes 75.89 seconds per runback. That's nearly as long as my actual winning attempt. Considering the fact that I may sometimes die to the knights at the end, I'm spending more than half my time on the runback. This isn't just a problem with this boss. You've likely also forgotten the lengthy runback for those gimmick bosses which are intended to be beaten relatively quickly, such as Deacons of the Deep, Yorm, and Wolnir. Honestly, I may have been spoiled by the extremely short runbacks of Lies of P, Kazan, and Nine Souls, where they pretty much just spawn you at the fog gate. However, I feel that runbacks are completely unnecessary to a game and ruin its quality of life. In my opinion, there's no reason not to just stick a bonfire in front of each boss, especially with runbacks like Osiris and Deacons of the Deep, where it can take longer than the boss itself. This is an issue which has been largely fixed in the DLC, as both of the final bosses, Gale and Frida, have some of, if not the shortest runbacks in the whole Souls series. Thank you, Miyazaki. The worst runbacks are those which pretty much just make you go through entire areas, like the Consumed King's Garden and the Cathedral of the Deep. There are a few shortcuts along the way, but they don't fix the long runbacks of these bosses, for which I've mentioned could be fixed relatively easily. This ties into my thoughts on their level design. I quite like the endgame areas, like Archdragon Peak, Lothric Castle, and the short untended graves. However, the game has quite a few bad areas. Same as everyone else, I don't like Poison Swamp levels, like Farron Keep and Road of Sacrifices. I'm also not a big fan of enemy gimmicks that are meant to just kill you once when they're hiding in a corner and you never fall for it again. This happens in Archdragon Peak, High Wall of Lothric, and almost every area that is almost synonymous with the game. It's not objectively bad, but I don't really see why it's important to make areas potentially more frustrating for a first playthrough. Maybe they want to make you more aware of your surroundings? Even by my 9th playthrough, I still needed a map for areas like Farron Keep, Catacombs of Karthus, and Irithyll Dungeon, where visibility is low and the path forward is often unclear. On the topic of Irithyll Dungeon, it is tied with Farron Keep as my least favorite area to traverse through in each playthrough. The area is somewhat confusing to explore with weird holes and entrances, and my least favorite enemies, rats and jailers. The jailers' lanterns have life drain, which makes them impossible to fully dodge. Their weapons prevent you from drinking Estus flasks and increase your equip load for some reason, and their attacks also have a grab that does a ridiculous amount of damage. This, alongside the large amount of rats which can stun lock you, and the tight corridors lead to a frustrating experience. The last part I'd like to mention are their questlines. This part might not annoy the average player, as many might go through the entire game without completing a single questline, but that's exactly the problem. Since the game doesn't handhold you, it's very hard to figure out what is necessary from many questlines. Sirius in particular was one of the most specific questlines in the game. You have to first initiate the questline with the Dream Chaser's Ashes, an item you get from a slightly hidden area in Farron Keep. Then, you have to find her small summon sign on the bridge in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, for which you have to backtrack for after beating the beast there. Then, you have to figure out where she went from a single item sold in the shop with slightly cryptic messaging. And lastly, you have to summon her for the Twin Princes fight. During all this, you specifically cannot offer a pale tongue to Rosaria, which as far as I'm aware, isn't very clearly explained. In general, the questlines in this game are convoluted and the player is scarcely given any guidance. Even worse for the 100%, finding and farming Covenant items is next to impossible nowadays. Without invasions, the items are given a ridiculously low drop rate from a few select elite mobs. The enemies are difficult to fight, yet bland, which makes them tedious to do for hours and hours at a time. All this to unlock content like spells, rings, and weapons. As I've talked about in this video, Dark Souls 3 has never quite clicked with me because of these factors. But there's one big aspect of the game I haven't fully covered that I very much enjoy: the DLC. Ashes of Ariandel and the Ring City are amazing additions to the game and would be one of my favorite games if they were a standalone title. Sister Frida is an amazing 3-phase boss. She starts with a decent first phase using her scythe and invisibility. Then Father Ariandel joins the fight, making for an interesting gank fight with some fun attacks. Lastly, her third phase is amazing, with crazy visuals, fun changes to the attacks of phase 1, and very cool design. She hard carries the first DLC, as it is relatively short if not for her inclusion. Then there's the Ringed City. All bosses except Half-Light of the Church are amazing.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
I'm a big fan of big bosses that do heavy, well-telegraphed attacks. I think Demon Prince is an underrated boss, as it's one of my personal favorite gank fights. Their slow attacks make them predictable, even as a gank fight. The gimmick where the second phase is dependent on which you kill first is also quite cool. I also love Midir. While his second phase is a little underwhelming, he is a boss with extremely cool design and some fun and well-telegraphed combos. The boss is quite difficult, but is fun to learn and intuitive. Then there's my favorite boss in the game. Slave Knight Gale is beloved by many, including me. The boss has a fun, aggressive beast-like phase 1. He stands upright for his phase 2, making his attacks more precise and intentional. He fights very differently, which makes his phases fun to learn. His third phase is much like his phase 2, but with longer, extended combos. The lightning can be sometimes frustrating, but it's visually amazing and really makes the fight feel like it's the last one in the series. So how do I feel about Dark Souls 3? I think it's a flawed and sometimes unpolished game. A lot of the quality of life of newer Souls-like games heavily add to my enjoyment, which is sadly not there for the originator of the genre and final of the trilogy, Dark Souls 3. It sometimes feels like they just add mechanics just to make it less enjoyable. However, there's many parts I love, such as the amazing DLC, cool builds, great atmosphere, and interesting lore. The game has some of my favorite and least favorite bosses, and helped create the genre I love. And while I appreciate its culture and what it has created, I don't think it holds up in 2025. But I'm not the end-all be-all of opinions, so feel free to let me know what you think.